Welcome to the Center Collaborative, Creative Solutions in Behavioral Health and Criminal Justice, brought to you by the Oregon Center on Behavioral Health and Justice Integration, which is also known as the Center. We at the Center are all about solutions. Our job in Oregon is to facilitate improvement of the system so behavioral health and criminal justice can work better together to engage people in treatment while promoting public safety. I am your host, Chris Thomas. I hold a master's degree in clinical psychology and have focused on the intersection between behavioral health and criminal justice for 20 years. Over 7 of those years were behind the walls of a maximum security prison. During this podcast, you will have the opportunity to sit in on real, in-depth conversations with experts about complex topics in a way that is both fascinating and digestible. We will focus not just on what is wrong with the system, but what is going right and how we can work together to evolve. On today's episode, I sit down with Terry Schroeder, OHA Civil Commitment Coordinator within the Certification, Licensure, and Technical Assistance Department. This is part 1 of a 2-part episode. Terry and I discuss what the civil commitment process looks like in the state of Oregon. We discuss civil commitment placements within the Continuum of Care, not just at the state hospital. We also talk about what is considered at different steps within the civil commitment process, and the emphasis on due process and voluntary engagement and treatment. We discuss the sticking points in switching lanes between the forensic track and the civil track, and the importance of coordinated work between law enforcement and the crisis worker. We also talk about the role of the investigator and what they're responsible for in the process. We end the conversation talking about the impact of vicarious trauma on crisis workers and the importance of self-care and post-vention interventions. I learned a lot during my conversation with Terry today. I think you will too. Welcome to our conversation. Today on the podcast, we had with us Terry Schroeder, who is the Civil Commitment Coordinator for the Oregon Health Authority in the Certification, Licensure, and Technical Assistance Department within the organization. Terry, thank you so much for joining us today. We're thrilled to have you on the podcast.
Thank you so much, Chris. It's great to be here.
Starting out our conversation, let's talk a little bit about what civil commitment looks like in Oregon, what it is in practice versus what folks think about when they think about civil commitment. Because I have a feeling that it's very different what it looked like historically, what people think it looks like, and what it looks like today.
It's a great question, and it does involve a lot of interesting dynamics to it. Civil commitment at its very base is designed to be a last resort option used for accessing care for somebody who meets a statutory requirement of either being a danger to self or danger to others or unable to care for basic needs due to a mental disorder. And again, inside of that, the due process rights and the procedure for determining who should and should not be civilly committed constantly is asking the question, is there another alternative to the civil commitment that would be less restrictive, as they call it? And the reason behind that is it's believed, and I agree with this too, is that the more the individual could be engaged in their own motivation for treatment, the better the treatment outcome. It's widely believed that because of that and the restriction of civil rights, civil commitment shouldn't be used unless it's absolutely necessary. That it's a very difficult process, a high bar to achieve in order for a civil commitment to occur. And sometimes there's a lot of frustration, oftentimes there's a lot of frustration with family members and other concerned people about their loved ones who they see suffering from a mental disorder and are wondering why, with all of the things that are going on with that person, that a civil commitment can't happen. Usually what that looks like in reality is multiple interventions with law enforcement, multiple interventions with crisis workers, trips to the emergency room, and sometimes even a mental health hold for a few days' time, but then released, only to recycle through that period of crisis again later on down the road. There's a lot of frustration about what does it take really for a person to be civilly committed. And so there's a lot of confusion and misunderstanding around that process and what happens inside of it. that results in a person not being civilly committed. In a numbers perspective, you could say 100 people might end up in a custody or evaluation at an emergency room, and of those 100 people, maybe only 10 will end up in the civil commitment process. 90% of the people who go through this tend not to end up in civil commitments, and that's because the bar for it is so high. The other piece to this is that civil commitment has a long history in every state in the country. It goes back to some fairly dark times where people's due process rights were not well managed and or attended to, and that resulted in some pretty grievous violations of personal rights and civil rights. As a result of that, there was a strong backlash that really strengthened and promoted the due process rights for individuals. That made it very difficult for people to go through a civil commitment process without this clear and convincing evidence being achieved, which is a necessary standard for a civil commitment. And so it's not enough for a person to have a mental disorder and to be struggling with that mental disorder. They also have to have that connected to risk factors that are pretty high. In the past, it was believed, and it was true to some degree, that people could be placed in hospitals without very much due process rights, without any representation, placed in these hospitals, especially big state hospitals, which is what most people went to back in the 60s and 50s and 40s. And then there was not a very clear pathway out of those state hospitals for many of these folks. There's stigma on that side, too, that once you become civilly committed, somehow you're just put away somewhere for an extended period of time and may or may not come out. And that also is not true. In fact, it's very much not true now because we do very little state hospital admissions.
Is it possible for someone to go through the civil commitment process and be found that they need to be civilly committed, that they meet that high bar, but they don't end up at the Oregon State Hospital and instead are placed somewhere else?
The majority of people right now who are under civil commitment do not go to the state hospital. In fact, if last I heard, we have about 40 beds for civil commitment at the state hospital level. The 700 or so people that are civilly committed annually here in Oregon, which is a very small percentage per capita for a population of around 4 million people. The vast majority of those folks are in acute care hospitals and or community-based settings.
I'm curious of the situation right now with the numbers, particularly during the pandemic, become even more so at the Oregon State Hospital, with most of the people that are in the hospital are there within the forensic track, whether that be aid and assist or fitness to proceed, whatever you want to call it, or guilty except for insanity. I'm curious if the placements outside of the hospital, acute care, and in the community are typical when the numbers are lower for forensics and more for civil commitment at the state hospital, or if the numbers were how they were before the pandemic, most people go to the state hospital or most people go to these other placements.
The pandemic has played a role in terms of the capacity of the state hospital to receive people, and so that's impacted all the populations. For that reason, and staffing issues too, have also played a role in the state hospital's ability to receive people. But it has been a trend for many years now that the forensic populations are occupying the majority of the state hospital beds. So that environment was already there before the pandemic and was made somewhat worse as a result of the pandemic. All of which has created backward pressure into the other systems. I think one of the things that's important to understand about this whole civil commitment process work is that it's based on the idea of there being a continuum of placements from a very less restrictive type of environment, like living independently out in the community, to an acute care hospital, to a state hospital for long-term care. And the reason for that is mental health issues and mental illness in general is a fluid and dynamic experience, so to speak, and that any one person with a mental illness is not going to have the same level of distress and or impact on their functioning throughout a period of time. And so they're going to have periods where there's stability and they're able to function independently and with supports. And then there are other times when the illness is more acute and requires more containment or a setting where they could get a higher level of care. And that's not going to stay that way for a long period of time. And they can then transition to a lower level of care. So you need to be able to move as needed, depending on how the illness is impacting that person, to respond to those needs. A healthy system is going to have all these different types of level of care to match what the need is for the person. When the system loses pieces of that, it creates changes in dynamics in terms of all of the other types of level of care. And so you find the system responding to that in ways that isn't always healthy for that person. For example, if you don't have the right lower level of care for a person that they might need available to you, such as a residential treatment home or a foster home or something of that nature, you may find yourself moving that person to a more acute care setting because that's what's available and provides for the safety. But it's too restrictive for what that person needs. But the need isn't being met out there. It's not available. And so you see changes in behavior that way too.
It seems like in the general community, when folks think about civil commitment and psychiatric care, the belief is that most people go to the state hospital. And I don't think that people realize that there is this continuum that is available within the civil commitment process based upon that person's medical necessity, how acute their symptomology is. Terry knows this, but I'm saying this for the listeners. It's a fancy word that we use when we talk about where someone fits. We say medical necessity, but just how acute their symptomology is, their safety concerns, that type of thing. I don't think most people realize that is the case when folks think of civil commitment. They think state hospital. So can you talk a little bit more about what that continuum of care looks like when we're talking about the civil commitment population and what the other options are other than state hospital placement? I know you've talked about it a little bit, but what, in a nutshell, is the difference as you're moving through the continuum?
So starting from just the community level, so you may have an individual who's going through a mental health crisis of one kind or another, and already at that level, it's fairly complex. The person may be experiencing any number of different stressors, and this may be a first break for a mental illness, or it may be something the person has experienced many times over, and they're several years into dealing with their mental illness. And that all creates a difference in terms of what available options can be utilized. There may be poverty, oftentimes there is. Oftentimes the person is struggling to have safe, supportive housing. There are a number of different stressors going on. These folks often have experienced traumas of many types, and there might be drug and alcohol use. In fact, that's a very prevalent issue as well. All of these things can conspire to an acute crisis where a person is acting or stating things that cause people to be concerned about their safety in addition to their mental health concerns. And that results in a law enforcement contact or a contact with a crisis worker out in the community somewhere, or possibly in an emergency room or even a jail booking center. It can take place any number of different places. During that assessment, the individual is engaged in a conversation by the crisis worker and the law enforcement officer to get a sense of two basic things. What are the risk factors right now? What do I need to be concerned about in terms of this person's safety and anybody else in the community? And two, is there a mental disorder that is driving this behavior? Or is there a probable cause, reason to believe that there's a mental disorder driving this behavior? And three, is there any mitigating factors or less restrictive alternatives that I can utilize that will give me some level of confidence that this person will both access care and be safe? If I can find those kinds of things, then those are the things I'm going to do. That can be anything from getting a family member to provide support and supervision, if that appears to be a reasonable option, or a follow-up with a mental health crisis worker or a mental health center the next day while they're being supervised by a friend. Is there some way in which I can contain this in a way that nobody gets hurt and the person has a reasonable chance of accessing services? Again, that less restrictive alternative. If those things can't be found, and it's a reasonable decision to take the person into custody, even before that, they're asked if they're willing to voluntarily take a ride to the hospital. If they're able to do that, and it's believed that they're in good faith in doing that, in other words, they're not going to change their mind, etc., then that's the preferred way of getting them to the hospital voluntarily. So even at the very beginning, any ability to get that person to be engaged in their own care and making decisions about getting that care is seen as preferable and legally required to do. But barring that, they could be taken into custody and driven to a hospital where they are further evaluated by a physician. And at that point, they go through further evaluation where there's medical screenings to make sure that there's no medical cause for this change in behavior, trying to determine what alcohol or drugs might be on board that might be causing this behavior, and ruling out those things as being the primary driver of the behavior. They're left with the ability to say that this is probably due to a mental disorder of some type. And then there's the risk assessment. Once that has been determined that the risk is still present, the person may be still having significant thoughts of self-harm or thoughts of harming someone else, or their illness is so pervasive that their functional skills are deteriorated to such a point that there's a risk of experiencing some sort of serious damage to themselves or medical risk. At that point, the physician can determine to take the person into the hospital.
For our listeners, we talk about risk a lot on this podcast. And usually when we talk about risk, we're talking about criminogenic risk, which is risk to commit another crime. And
Right.
so that is different than the risk that Terry is talking about now. So now we're talking about risk around harming yourself, harming someone else, or not being able to take care of yourself. I just wanted to take a moment to have that clarification so it's not confusing, because in the criminal justice world and in the behavioral health world, sometimes we have the exact same word for very different things. It gets really confusing. So I just wanted to pop in and clarify for the listeners that when we're talking about civil commitment and we talk about risk, generally that's the type of risk we're talking about. We're not talking about risk to commit another crime. Do you want to add anything to that?
Yes, but there is overlay to that too, because sometimes the risk does involve thoughts or ideas or actually engaging in behaviors that result in crime, such as harming somebody else or assaulting someone else. And so there is overlap in that respect, or possibly damaging property and or setting fires. Any number of things can result in criminal charges as well as mental health related issues that can cause custody or commitment. And so there is an overplay between the two. And a lot of what's fascinating about this whole work is that at that point of assessment by the law enforcement officer in the crisis work, decisions are made as to which track that person's going to go towards, whether it be a criminal justice one or a mental health one. And so I think that's probably one of the most important pieces to this whole intervention process is the coordinated work between the law enforcement officer and the crisis worker to come to some understanding as to what's driving this behavior. And that will result in whether they go to a jail or go to a hospital, that decision point. The training and coordination between those two groups is just critical for making good decisions, because once that decision's made, it tracks a person in a pretty significant way in terms of what their experience is next. And once a person who has a mental disorder is in jail, as I think many of our listeners would know, is that is the wrong place for a person with a mental illness to be. And there are many people with mental illness in jails. I've spent a lot of time working with folks and counseling folks and assessing folks in jails. And jails are more challenging and make the illness worse. It is not a place that is helpful for them if they have a significant mental health disorder.
Jails have, because they've had to, jails and prisons really improved their trauma-informed care and their treatment of folks in their custody with behavioral health concerns. Also, they're not a treatment facility. That's not what they're designed to do. So if there's someone in their custody who needs to be there because of their charges, that's one thing. But when we're talking about it in this regard, usually we're talking about folks that are coming to the attention of law enforcement primarily due to the symptoms they're experiencing. And if that's the case, then jails and prisons are not the best place for those folks because they tend to do worse. It's this interesting catch-22 in that jails and prisons don't get to choose who they take. And unfortunately, they have ended up being the psychiatric service as the default in some cases, which is not a comfortable place for them, nor for the people in their care.
And I think you'll see nationally and in the state of Oregon as well, the vast majority of people who are in locked housing, you're going to find more of them in jails than anywhere else in the state. And you're right, that has become the default placement for many people with mental illness is the jails, and that's unfortunate.
This makes me think of, Terry, the difficulty that some communities talk about, that once a person is on that route, that jail route, instead of the civil commitment route, it seems like there's a lot of difficulty of once that person becomes more and more acute of changing lanes. So once you go into the jail route, it seems like it's really hard to get that person over into the civil commitment side of things. And I've heard lots of explanations for that sticking point, and I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, and it's a complex issue, really, in terms of that sticking point, so to speak, because it can involve a number of different factors. One of which, of course, is people are complex, and the interplay between one's mental state and their motivations and intentions for the behaviors that they do can come from different forms of intention and or insight and judgment around that. And of course, a mental illness is going to have an impact on that insight and that judgment and that intention and their impulse control and the decisions that they make. To what degree that is impacting that person is the question the mental health professional and the jail are trying to understand. So just on an individual level, they're asking themselves, is this person acting as somebody who's intoxicated or under the influence? Or is this person acting as somebody who has a mental disorder? Or is this somebody acting in a criminal way? And oftentimes, there's some combination of all three of those things at play. The complexity is understanding which one is the primary driver. And that can be a difficult thing to do, especially in the moment of a crisis or an event. So that's one piece. And that has to be figured out in booking before the person is booked into the jail, because once they're booked into the jail, the person is now under the custody of the jail and of the criminal court. For the person to be extracted out of the jail into a psychiatric setting for treatment requires permission for the judge to release that custody to the hospital for that treatment purpose. And there's a mechanism for doing that, but it is a much more complex mechanism that involves both the agreement with the prosecution, the defense, and the judge. All three have to be in agreement that this person's mental illness is significant enough to warrant that kind of change in venue, so to speak. And once that happens, they go to the hospital. The hospital also has to be on board with the purpose for them being admitted. They have to be in agreement with it and feel like there's a mental disorder that they are treating in order to meet the medical necessity you mentioned before. So all of those parts have to be working in conjunction with one another and in agreement with one another, all the while dealing with somebody who's a complex individual who is going to be showing different motivations at different times. So, yeah, it can happen, but once the person is in jail, it is much more difficult to get them out of the jail setting.
Part of the explanation I've heard around the changing of lanes and everybody needing to be on board, with the case law in Oregon, the bar is so high for civil commitment. And once they're in a jail a little bit and they stabilize a little bit just from being in a confined environment, sometimes it's really difficult to know, or the bar is so high, if civil commitment is going to go through. I've heard that folks then get nervous because this person is, because they're very complex, they may have symptoms or they may be engaging in behavior where if the charges are dropped, then what are we going to do if it's not a very clear civil commitment process? I've heard nerves around that, and that's part of the sticking point that I've heard about. I'm curious if you've heard about that and if you have some thoughts around how that can be navigated.
Yeah, so one of the things that I stress a lot when I do the trainings for civil commitment investigators and examiners both, but mostly the investigators, is that the requirement for the initial custody and or determination to go to a hospital to be evaluated for a mental health hold is that you need a probable cause level of evidence, which is a reasonable set of information that any reasonable clinician would come to the same basic conclusion that this person has a mental health problem and as a result of that, a risk to themselves or somebody else. And that they have some basic sense that a hold would take place if they were seen by a physician. Not certainty, but just that a hold would be likely to be the outcome based on that physician's evaluation, and assuming something else unbeknownst to them might show up that would cause them to change their mind. So that's really all that's required to make that initial decision to take somebody to a hospital in custody and have them evaluated. They don't need to be asking the question at that point as to whether or not a civil commitment is going to occur. That's not the question at the moment. So then the physician has the same kind of probable cause requirement to determine that if I place this person on a hold, is it likely or probable that a court would find this person to be civilly committed? And so they're leaning into the future with this decision-making process, but they don't have to have certainty or absolute clarity. I think that's the thing that people often make a mistake about, is thinking that they have to be clear as to what a judge would decide many days from now and under very different circumstances in terms of information, because there's so much not known at the beginning stages of this that become clearer over time. And you can see a person's response to treatment and to a stable environment and to sleep and food and other kinds of interventions that make an impact. And for that reason, many people end up not going to civil commitment. But you don't know what that intervention is going to do initially. And so you are making just a probable cause assessment as opposed to having some clarity as to what a judge would think. And I really caution clinicians to not overthink that part, because they just don't know. There's just so much not known at that point of first contact. That's one of the challenges of being an investigator or a crisis worker with that director's custody authority, is to be able to understand how that diagnostic differential assessment requirement is made in the field with somebody who you know very little about, and try to make a good diagnostic assessment that there's probably a mental disorder at play here, and oftentimes that's very apparent, and also what the risk factors are in terms of this person following through with harming themselves or somebody else. And just to complicate things further, sometimes people will also see these kinds of things as access points to needed services. So, for example, sometimes you have folks who are in a criminal situation who they've been picked up on criminal charges, and they may see the mental health process as a way of diverting away from their criminal consequences to a mental health one. And so you'll see sometimes people amplify or exaggerate mental health problems as a way of avoiding criminal consequences. So you have to be on the lookout for that situation. Sometimes you see folks with addiction issues who may speak about their mental health related issues and downplay what their addictions are causing them to do. And sometimes you see folks with mental health issues who don't want to talk about their mental health problems. They would rather explore addiction or other kinds of issues. It is really a very complex, dynamic, and challenging environment to make these decisions in. Overthink it just adds another layer of unnecessary complexity in terms of whether a person would be civilly committed or not.
Substance use or long-term substance use, I know that can look like mental health concerns. And that sometimes, because people are complex, we're just going to keep saying that in this podcast, that depending on how long people have been using, the kind of substances they've been using, how their body reacts to the substances, it may take a while for that to wane so you can see where someone is with their psychiatric issues. And I'm imagining that there is a problem with how that lines up in the timeline on, are we going to go the civil commitment route versus are we going to go the forensic route? I would imagine that there's a bit of a squishiness in there that doesn't line up real well.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Once again, yes, people are incredibly complex, and the impact of substances on their mental state varies a great deal from one individual to another, whether or not they're early on in their use pattern or if this is something that they've done for many years. It makes a difference in terms of how they manage their intoxications or their changes in state, and or what kind of physiological changes take place over time. It is also possible for someone to have a drug-induced psychosis, for example, and then develop a psychotic disorder that is not because of the drug, but because of what the drug created or stimulated physiologically in the person. You can have somebody who starts out with a drug-related problem and end up with a significant mental health problem, or the opposite as well. Somebody with a psychological problem who is using drugs and alcohol to manage their mental health problems, but then end up with an addiction secondary to their mental health problems. Then, of course, you've got the trauma that goes along underneath all of that as part of it. So yeah, again, it really does take getting to know who that person is as best you can in as short a period of time as required to get a sense of those kinds of things. That takes some skill and it takes experience from the clinician to be able to quickly sort through where they want to focus their attention in terms of the questions and who they need to ask other questions of to get as clear as possible in as quick a period of time in order to make the best decision possible, knowing fully well that you don't have all the access to all the facts and you don't get to see how the person responds to the detox process and what kind of mental health issues remain following that detox process, and also what the person's ability to respond to treatment alternatives are going to be. You have to make a good determination as to whether or not it's possible or probable that you're going to end up in a certain place once you do the intervention. It's an exploratory process, essentially.
Those are really difficult questions, and I could see where you say, don't overthink it. It just needs to reach a certain level. And then there's another level after that. So what is a threshold for if there's a hold or not? And then what that looks like as it goes up? Who are the folks who are making those determinations and what are they looking for?
Just to clarify, the initial person out in the street, the director's custody, really has only authority to say, I think this person has a mental disorder of some type, and I think that mental disorder is resulting in a risk that I can't manage safely out in the community. And so I'm going to authorize a law enforcement officer to take this person to the hospital for further assessment. Once they get to that certified hospital, then it's a physician who does the assessment along with their medical team and their social worker, and in some cases a crisis worker from the mental health program, all work collaboratively to gather medical information, psychosocial history, mental status examination, as well as risk assessment. They collaboratively come together to a decision, but it's ultimately going to be the physician's decision to place a person on a hold. Once the physician makes that determination, they then go into a psychiatric setting, hopefully if there's room in one, to find one. Otherwise, they stay in the emergency room, which is happening more and more often these days because of a lack of capacity at the acute care hospital level. Part of that is because the acute care hospitals can't move their fund to other settings like the state hospital because of the lack of capacity. Aside from that issue, assuming that everything goes as it's supposed to, it's the physician who places the hold and then files what we call a notice of mental illness with the court, and that launches an investigation by the mental health program. They have one of their investigators begin to investigate the possibility of a civil commitment. That happens over the span of 5 judicial days, but usually by the third day judicially, the investigator has to make a decision about a recommendation to a hearing. And so over that 3-day or 5-day period of time, depending on weekends and holidays, a lot of information has to be gathered to come to the decision with the physician, because without the physician's agreement and without the physician's support, a civil commitment is almost impossible to achieve. You have to work collaboratively with the hospital and with the physician and their team to come to the same conclusion, essentially, that civil commitment is the only alternative we have to keep this person safe and to treat their mental illness in a way that is productive.
So is that the civil commitment investigator that's making that determination along with the physician?
That's right.
The investigator, is that a master's level clinician?
The qualifications for a civil commitment investigator is that they have to be what's called a qualified mental health professional, which is typically a master's level person with a psychology background or a social work background. There's some variations to that, but typically that's the case. The person then has to go through my class, which is a 12-hour course, but only 8 hours of it are required for me to teach people about this incredibly complex process over that period of time of just 8 hours of training, which is not nearly enough to go into the details as much as I would like to around this whole process. They then get that certification from me after completing the course and completing the test. They also have to have the recommendation from the director to be an investigator, and that is the qualifications. Typically, these folks are in crisis teams, and so they're usually involved in the mobile crisis team or some portion of the crisis program. And so they're involved as a director's designee as well. Oftentimes, these programs experience a lot of turnover, and so that sometimes they're young clinicians who don't have a lot of experience in this work, or they've been in the work for a long time. Because you'll find that some folks who do this work for a long period of time, it's because they love this work and that they're just built for it, so to speak. But sometimes clinicians come in because this is where they can get into the field. And they're told by the director, I want you to become an investigator and do this investigation work, and they just have not had any experience with it at all. You'll find that the master's level programs tend not to have much curriculum around crisis work or especially civil commitment. And so there's not a lot of preparation, and so it's on-the-job training, essentially. It's my view that it takes a couple of years for a good crisis worker to really have their feet fully grounded in all the different skill sets needed to do this work really well. Typically, most crisis workers don't stay in the crisis teams more than a couple of years. And that's true across the nation. And the pandemic has made that worse.
Yeah.
Because the crisis workers are one of the essential workers that remained in the field during this entire pandemic. So their exposure risk was much higher than many other treatment programs that were doing their work virtually. And so these folks, these mobile crisis team folks like law enforcement and EMTs, et cetera, are out in the field during this time. It was very stressful. And so a lot of programs are experiencing challenges maintaining their staff on their crisis teams.
You end up seeing a lot of things you kind of learn on the job. I know when I went for my master's program and then started working, it was very different than even my practicum rotations, and a lot of things you figure out while you're there. So you learn a lot very quickly, and you're exposed to a lot of things that can stay with you.
Absolutely.
And sometimes that's difficult.
Yeah. In my case, I got my training at Antioch University in Seattle, and my internship and master's program was at a crisis receiving center, Capitol Hill. And one of my first clients that I was working with, it was short-term brief therapy, but these were the folks that would come to the crisis receiving center as an alternative to civil commitment or as a referral following their civil commitment. That's where I experienced my first completed suicide, was an intern. One of the things I had to learn very quickly, and many do in this situation, is to determine whether or not I wanted to work with a population that could potentially die in the course of my treatment with them. And so it became a reality that in this work, people do die. And sometimes there's nothing you can do about it, or even foresee the possibility of it. That whole reality came in very quickly. I had to ask myself if I wanted to continue in this work. And so I did so with kind of a mindfulness around it, that if I'm going to continue with this work, I needed to also take care of myself in this work in order to maintain doing it. And so those two lessons came home very quickly. The third one was also in the process of this person's death, I also experienced what it was like to be someone who experienced the death of somebody I cared about. Because I had a good rapport with this person. I felt close to this person. I felt like we were making progress in the therapy. And the system does a process of evaluation to determine whether or not there's any risk associated with that person's death. What that entails initially is making sure that other clients who had relationship with this person weren't going to be negatively impacted in such a way that they too became at risk. And so there wasn't a contagion that would be created, which can happen with suicides. And so the first point of intervention, once that event occurred, was to make sure all the other clients were safe and that they were working through their grief response to that loss. The second line of intervention was to make sure all the other clinicians were managing well. So there was debriefings for them as well. The third point of intervention was to make sure that the liability was being managed. So there was a looking at my chart to make sure that I had been doing my work properly and that there wasn't any liability associated with anything that I was doing clinically. That involved me sitting at a table with supervisors, managers, and administrators reviewing my chart and asking me questions at the end of the day. And at the end of it, they closed my chart and said, Terry, it looks like you did a very good job and there was nothing you could do about this. This was unforeseeable. We're really sorry that happens. I hope you take good care of yourself. They then closed the chart, and that was the end of my day. I walked away from that thinking, this is not how postvention should happen. There was quite a bit of education at that early point. From that point forward, as a supervisor of crisis teams, it's been very clear to me that crisis workers need to be supported in this work in ways that's mindful about the vicarious trauma that they experience doing this work, just like all other first line responders, and that there needs to be structured post-vention interventions with folks in order for them to work through those events when they occur so that they're educated and strengthened by them as opposed to made to feel somehow responsible or left with feelings that cause them to be less effective as clinicians, and that vicarious trauma shuts them down in certain ways that negatively impacts their life in general. I've seen that happen many times over the years. I've seen agencies become more aware of the vicarious trauma impacts on clinicians as they do this work. If they handle it correctly, the clinicians become better clinicians and more seasoned and more mindful and aware and can absorb that work experience to their benefit. And it has been hugely beneficial to me. It's been such a great honor to do the work that I've done over all these years with folks. It took work and effort and mindfulness on my part to make sure that I was caring for myself properly. That's something I promote with clinicians as well, because that ultimately benefits the people that they serve.
A lot of conversation when we talk about vicarious trauma. We've talked about it with law enforcement, within correctional facilities, and in courts. But it's interesting, a lot of the times we don't talk about it with behavioral health staff. I guess there's an assumption that we're therapists, so we know how to handle it. It sneaks up on you. And sometimes it sneaks up on you when you're not doing it anymore. I know for me, when I promoted out of the institution and was working at administration, that is when it hit me, is when I was no longer working in the institution, because in the institution, you're doing what you need to do. And even if you're trying to take care of yourself, you can push that stuff down. And so when you're no longer in that pressure cooker, sometimes that's when the anxiety and the trauma starts hitting you. And then you have weird moments where you think, what is going on with me? And it takes a little while to figure out that it's that vicarious trauma that kind of catches up with you after a little while.
Yeah, it has an impact. Yeah, it's different from one person to another as to what the impact's going to be, but oftentimes it's like any other kind of mental health problem. We often don't recognize it or see it as that while it's impacting us. We lack the insight, so to speak, into understanding that. And it sometimes takes other people saying, "Are you okay?" Bring it home to us. But yeah, it can show up at very different times. Sometimes even flashbacks of certain events or places can show up. Memories and dreams, all sorts of things can occur. Or just the numbing that can happen over time. Because what we're doing is trying to protect ourselves in some psychological fashion from all of the intense suffering that we're bearing witness to on a regular basis.
Yeah.
There's not training around that kind of self-protection and systemic things in place for those to be addressed proactively. Clinicians are all going to be left to their own devices and their own training and knowledge about how to deal with that, and some of it's more effective than others. But in all cases, it impacts us. In all cases, it impacts us. The question is how, to what benefit or not.
And impacts the work we do.
That's the work we do.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I'm glad we talked about this because I don't think it gets talked about enough. The impact that this work has on everybody in the system who are bearing witness to some really difficult things. So I'm really glad we talked about that because I always want to highlight that piece of it and the self-care and the wellness and how important it is, because if folks aren't taking care of themselves and they're not given the support within the system and make it okay for them to take care of themselves, and it's normalized that while we see some pretty impactful things that most people don't see, and that takes a different level of support. If we don't talk about that and we don't talk about the need for that, then we see burnout in our clinicians. That impacts them, and it also impacts the work they do. And so we see this turnover because it's just so difficult to continue to do the work without the support.
Yeah, and I think it impacts the ability for the person to connect with other individuals as they're engaging with them in crisis. And part of the art of doing this work is to be literally open and authentic and non-judgmental as much as possible, curious about everything, willing to engage. I can't approach these crisis situations and be effective by being pulled back, by being defended, or being just a professional person asking professional questions. That does not work because the other person doesn't experience you as a real human being who cares about what's happening to them. And
Right.
they are, to a person, extremely sensitive to that issue because of what they're experiencing. They need to have another human being who actually cares and is compassionate towards what's going on, even though the decision may be to take them into custody or not. But you have to be a real human being in order to do that. In addition to that, another part of your process is to be looking for signs and symptoms of a mental disorder or addiction or criminality. And so you're doing this linear process behind the scenes, so to speak, of assessing and doing diagnosis while you're being real at the same time and being engaged and trying to de-escalate that person and seeing how they respond to those attempts or not. And also asking other questions. Who else should I talk to in order to get a better understanding of what I should do? Because what I'm about to do is going to restrict that person's rights or place them in an environment that they may not be safe in by letting them go. And I don't want to have something bad happen to them or somebody else. And at the same time, I don't want to restrict their rights such that they have a negative unintended consequence that can be far-reaching. If they go into a hospital and have to pay a hospital bill, or they lose their job because they don't show up the next day. Any number of things can happen that are not good for that person. So you're doing all of that as well as being a real person and doing that work. And you can't do all of that if you haven't done your self-care and managed the process of doing this work in such a way that it feels natural to you.
It's a science and an art.
There's a science and an art, and when clinicians first start, they're just trying to figure out the steps to take, the technical aspects of it. What form do I fill out? When do I fill it out? How do I get to this person? How quickly do I get to this person? What kind of questions am I supposed to ask? All of those technical details take a while to figure out. Once that gets incorporated into your system, then you get to be able to be a clinician and kind of a professional. And so then you approach it in a professional way. And then once you get that worked in and you're integrating the clinical work and the forensic work, the legal aspects of it together, then you can start getting into the art form of it. And so that takes yet even more time to get to that place. So there's quite a dedication and commitment to the process, so to speak, before you really hit your stride as an investigator. It's really a joy to work with those investigators across the state who have hit that place because their knowledge and understanding is very rich in terms of how to work within their own systems and how to work with folks. And to a person, they're very dedicated to doing what's right for the people they work for. It's quite an honor to work with them too.
Definitely gems within the system, and rare gems because we have so much turnover.
Right, exactly.
Thank you for joining us for part 1 of our conversation with Terry Schroeder, OHA Civil Commitment Coordinator within the Certification, Licensure, and Technical Assistance Department at OHA. We look forward to you joining us next time for part 2 of our conversation with him. The Center Collaborative is a production of the Oregon Center on Behavioral Health and Justice Integration, a specialized division of Greater Oregon Behavioral Health Incorporated. It is produced by me, Chris Thomas, with production assistance from Patrick Kennedy. Music by Patrick Mulvihill and Patrick Kennedy. Subscribe to the Center Perspective using your favorite app. To learn more about criminal justice and behavioral health in Oregon, visit the Center's website at ocphji.org. You can also find us on Facebook. We'd love to hear from you. Please reach out to us. Join us next time as we chat with the experts about programs and partnerships at work within this complex and yet compelling field.